Hello, you may be seated. My name is Dan Carlsen, and I'm a seminarian from CDSP, and I'm really grateful to be here at St. Mark's this morning and to have been invited by Reverend Nikki. I'm going to walk around a little bit because, it's a labyrinth that seems made for walking, so why hide myself back there? Anyway, sermon. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So when I was in college, there was this little restaurant on my college campus. It was called Mr. Jim's. I loved Mr. Jim's, especially their soup bar and their oatmeal cookies. I would spend long hours in there, particularly getting a late lunch or an early dinner, sometimes sitting in a back corner booth doing my homework. It was a kind of home away from home. Or at least it was a home away from home when they weren't being shut down for health code violations, which happened with some regularity. The thing of it is that I never really paid much attention to this. I was just annoyed whenever I would go there to get my booth and they'd be shut down. I had heard the rumors on my campus about food poisoning and stuff like that, and I had heard the rumors centered largely around the soup bar, which I patronized regularly, but I just never really connected it as having anything to do with me. I just kept coming back, and shortly after I graduated from college, I heard the place had been shut down for good. I think my relationship with Mr. Jim's is in many ways kind of emblematic of our relationship with food in the modern industrialized West. We don't actually give it all that much thought. We're just used to getting what we want when we want it, and when it's not available, we perceive that as an inconvenience at best. The idea of food as something that is limited or precious or fragile. The idea that life and death issues are involved with our food. It's just not a daily reality for many of us. This was all far from the case in Jesus' time. In his day, hunger was incredibly common. A very tiny percentage of the population of the first century Roman world ate their fill with any regularity. For most people, whether they were rural farmers or they were urban craftsmen, that sensation of regular gnawing hunger was a very present reality. People understood what it was to be undernourished, to be underfed, and to be uncertain of how they were going to obtain enough of that thing upon which their life depended. You know that line in the Lord's Prayer where we ask about our daily bread? Well, according to liturgical scholars like Andrew McGowan, that phrase has its roots in the actual fear of not knowing where your next meal is coming from. When we pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," we're actually praying to not be perpetually anxious about our source of food. The world of Jesus and the early church was one where hunger could be used in that way as a very powerful metaphor, because for them it was not an abstraction. It was a constant reality. We need to bear all of this in mind as we come to today's gospel reading. It's part of a long stretch of Sundays where we journey through John chapter 6, and it's very prominent use of the image of bread. For those of us in the modern world, this particularly carb-heavy stretch of the gospel tends to make us think about bakeries. It tends to make us think about that lovely smell of fresh-baked goods. It doesn't right away make us think about the reality of grinding hunger. But I think we need to shift our perspective just a bit if we're going to hear a vital part of what Jesus is saying in these passages. The symbols of bread and of hunger aren't meant to remind us of luxury at the end of the day, but of necessity. They're meant to make us think about what sustains us and gives us the ability to get through life. So to get the full power of this symbolism, we have to back way up to the beginning of the Bible's symbolic narrative, the Garden of Eden. The biblical tale begins with this symbol of woman and man living in this state of bliss where they have access to every food they could ever want, and it's all provided for them free of charge. They have no need to worry where tomorrow's food is coming from. They are living a divinely catered existence in paradise. And the only rule they are given is don't eat from that one tree over there, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We all know how this turns out. I'm not going to talk about that tree. I want to talk about a different tree. So there's another tree that is mentioned in Genesis chapter 3. It's called the tree of life. And apparently, this is a tree that if you eat from it, you live forever. It's right there in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve have unrestricted access to it, and yet they don't eat from it. They eat from the tree of getting yourself kicked out of paradise. And then they get kicked out of paradise, and they never get to nibble from the tree of life. This becomes kind of a theme, that life is going to be different once these earliest humans make this decision. As Genesis 3:19 has God put it, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground. Food is now going to be scarce, hunger is going to be a persistent reality, starvation a constant threat. It could have been different, but Adam and Eve chose poorly. And this theme just keeps coming back throughout the biblical tale. Humans are given the capacity to choose something that contains life, and instead they choose things which bring pain, or suffering, or despair. It's like we humans can't help ourselves. We feel this constant hunger, but for some reason we keep choosing to feed on things that turn to ash in our mouths. Consider King David in today's reading. David is king of Israel. He has wealth, power, luxury, fame, all that stuff. He's spent his life securing his hold on power, playing games of war and politics. He's even ordered the occasional murder, just to be sure. All because he can't wait to get to the top. And then when he gets there, it turns out the top is kind of empty. He gets there and his neglect of justice leads his own son, Absalom, to lead a rebellion against him. He flees his capital city for his life from his son. He's in hiding when we get to our reading today, when word comes to him that the armies of his son have been defeated and his son has been killed. And when this news reaches David, he's shattered. We realize that he had been nurturing this hope that maybe somehow there was a way he could repair things with Absalom. And yet, that's never going to happen. It's too late. And in his grief, David says that he wishes he could trade places with his son. All of his royal power, all of his luxury, all of his wealth, his gold filigree existence, it's all turning to ashes in his mouth. It's a very poor substitute for the love that sustained him, that he shared with his son. With that theme in mind, we can look back at the gospel. Our gospel reading is set 1,000 years after the scene with King David, and a new kind of kingdom is being preached by a descendant of David, Jesus, this guerrilla rabbi from backwater Nazareth. Crowds are turning out to hear him. Some are witnessing miracles. Our story today, in fact, happens in the aftermath of the story of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus miraculously feeds this massive crowd by multiplying this tiny sack lunch with some bread and some fish. The crowds are trying to process what all of this means, and they're hoping for some leftovers. 12 baskets of leftovers have been mentioned. And remember that grinding, omnipresent hunger that people feel. Jesus has begun to use this food and this miracle of food as a symbol for something else, something even greater than daily bread. He's begun to talk about himself as the bread of life, the revelation of God, food from God, a way to actually feed on God in a human life. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, the crowd starts getting skeptical. Somebody in the crowd is like, hey, don't I know the bread of heaven? Here's Dad. This is Joseph's kid, right? I mean, I think he fixed my fence once. But Jesus presses on. Folks see the physical ordinariness of Jesus as their fellow Galilean peasant as somehow disqualifying him from being any kind of revelation of God, but he just continues. He says, your ancestors ate divine food, the manna in the wilderness, and yet they all died. Manna, as you'll recall back in the book of Exodus, is this delicious miracle food that is provided direct from God, free of charge, every morning to the Israelite ancestors when they wander for 40 years in the wilderness. They literally just have to go outside their tent every day and pick it up off the ground. And yet, in that story, after a while, the people become bored with this tasty free heaven food. The story seems to suggest that even if we got what we think we want, we would end up wanting something else. Like King David crying in his palace, we would find that our goods don't actually satisfy our deepest needs. There's a deeper kind of hunger at work in us humans. And while it doesn't negate our need for things like physical food, it does put all of our various hungers in a certain perspective. When Jesus calls folks to come to him, to learn from God, to seek the bread of life, he's gathering a community which is going to do things very differently, which is going to feed these deepest hungers, and which will do so by feeding on Jesus' own example of pouring out our very ordinary-looking lives for the good of others. In Jesus' time, food scarcity fundamentally shaped the way power worked. Hungry crowds accepted bread doles from emperors, politicians, guilds, patrons, generals, whoever really. These food distributions commanded serious political and economic loyalty in the Roman world because of that hunger that I keep on mentioning. Food in Jesus' world was power. In all likelihood, the folks in our story are asking Jesus about this food. They're following him after this thing because they're wondering if he's going to set up some sort of divine equivalent of one of these food patronage systems. And Jesus moves very quick to nip that idea in the bud. He's pushing for something bigger than a system that controls human loyalty through your belly. The image of Jesus as the bread of life became embedded in the earliest centuries of Christian practice in the form of their Eucharistic feasts. And in the early centuries, these were much more than just a bite of bread and a sip of wine. They were full, if often simple, meals. They were places where people could eat their fill. These meals embodied a radical new ethic where people of all social classes were fed by communal effort, not to ensure the poorest members' political loyalty, but simply because they were sisters and brothers who deserved to be fed. God had been revealed in Jesus, and God had pointed his community towards the food of justice and mercy and love of neighbor. All of this may lead us 21st century Jesus followers to pause, maybe for just a second, and think about what sort of hungers and fears are controlling us today. What kinds of unsatisfying food are we trading away our lives for? What cynical systems are commanding our loyalty because they say they'll feed us? What might it look like if we were brave enough to choose something different? In Jesus, the Eucharist becomes a second chance at making that decision that Adam and Eve botched back in Eden. When we gather at Christ's table, we are able to choose the food which actually does give unending life, and not the stuff that turns to ashes. May God give us the courage to feed upon love and justice. May God give us the patience to feed upon connection and community. And may God give us the wisdom to recognize the bread of life, no matter how ordinary it looks. Amen.